We potentially, depending on time, we'll have a few opportunity for general closing questions, but in essence, the majority of this is really a Q&A between us and you around the different 3-9 grids. Okay? So, your discussion point. So one of the things that when we've produced the model before, I think one of the things that's kind of a useful question is, what are the factors that you consider when selecting potential vendors? So how many of you actually would consider yourself a vendor or a supplier? Let's start with a question there. Okay, so half a dozen or so, maybe slightly more. See how honest we want to be about this. How many of you are from corporate environment? Okay, vast majority. Public sector? Okay, oh, interestingly, limited. So what are the key factors that you consider when looking at potential vendors or suppliers of learning technology solutions? Put that scope around it, because obviously that's what we're primarily going to talk about. What are the key things that you think are important? Discuss. 5 minutes, go. The one thing I always find about this room is that there's no clock. Just give us a 5-minute warning at the end, that's all. That's the easiest thing. I mean, the reality is the way it's structured. Yeah. I think we've said it every year. You take it, lead this thing.
sort of time up, so we just need you to wrap up your conversations and really start to get some insights from yourselves around. So, what factors? I know you're not done. You still need you need another 25 minutes, don't you, to try and get all these factors out. But I assume that you weren't just talking about the weather. There was...
Okay. See, that worked. I know all this talking.
I know it's a conversation. So.
Yeah. So what do we think? What are the factors we consider when choosing vendors? Who wants to just give us some ideas from the floor? Cost? Do you start with cost or end with cost? Okay, right. Cost, value for money, yeah? Okay, so very different things there. So something around their kind of their future potential, roadmap, innovation, and then something which financial stability. You know, are they going to still be in business by the time we actually get to deploy this? Kind of relatively sensible question. Yep. Right. Do they do what we want them to do? How do they fit that? Maybe what's their track record around it? You know. Right. Okay. So so particularly on a system side, that's obviously become something that's become really near the top of the list. Okay. You know, are we going to get people to use it when we deliver it to them? And it's something that everybody would have always talked about as being important, but in reality, kind of most of the decisions were based on, you know, administration, functionality, and everything else, etc. Yeah. What else? Sorry. So culture of the organisation, do they think that they're a good fit for us as a business? Do we like the people? Okay, so services, so again, that could be a requirements issue. We have certain service levels and things we request, but it's also part of a trust and knowing they're going to be there if it goes wrong and how responsive are they going to be. Yeah? Okay, feedback from other customers. How many of you do reference checks with existing customers before you award a contract? Yeah, you can be bolder, come on. Yeah? Yeah, so the answer is actually not everybody. Okay, that's actually it's one of those things, it appears on every RFP, you know, example customers, but actually sometimes the level of due diligence in checking those is limited, you know, is not what it might be. You know, okay. What else?
To expand on kind of the people side, it's actually the relationship. So
okay.
In other words, are they going to sell you something and run away, or are they going to sell you something and then carry on the journey with you to actually make sure you get to success?
Okay. Yeah. So there's something there which is about the relationship. There's inherently something about the individuals as well as the organisation, and there is something about continuity of relationship. How many of you had issues with suppliers because of changes in people and individuals involved in working with you? Again, it's a fairly common experience. We do a lot of research across large corporate organizations, and often vendor relationships are very dependent on some personal relationships on both sides. It can go wrong both ends, of course, as well. So, yeah, any other things? Is that a good set, David? Yeah. What happens when you check a referral and they say they didn't like them very much? How many of you had that experience? Do you always get good referrals? Yeah? Because I think that's obviously one of the questions that really is, you know, I was talking to somebody earlier and they were talking about a major upgrade process they're going through, and they were discussing the fact that they had just gone and asked for some reference customers around people who had gone through that. They spoke to 3 reference customers who universally, across all 3, said how bad the experience was. Okay? So either you've got to say that wasn't very well selected, or actually there was maybe more of a degree of integrity around the fact, you know, they were real conversations rather than just a bit of basic markups. I don't know. Interesting. So there's a lot of factors that you've talked about there. You've talked about organisation and the fit. You've talked about actually some fit to requirements and what they do. We've talked about does the you know, something around customer references and advocacy. We've talked about cost. There's a whole bunch of different things we look at. Sorry, Matt.
One thing which like I looked at last week in vendor was actually technology. So in other words, what technology are they running on? What's their architecture underlying? Are they digitally secure? All
Right.
of these aspects, that's the non-functional aspects, which
Yeah.
tend to kind of get left off sometimes.
Right.
Certainly, we made this part of it in half when we went to our
So basically the non-functional factors around that, including some things around technical architecture and security, etc. I'm just repeating that in case anybody didn't hear what they're saying. So there's lots of factors that we consider when doing that. And I think the key thing is, do you believe, so if we take a hypothetical scenario and said you're all going to buy an LMS, okay, do you all believe you have the same requirements? Okay. Actually, a lot of them are common, right? But do you think all you have the same? So when you're assessing potential solutions, what you are trying to do typically is based on your organization, your needs, your culture, your timescales, your budget, your whatever, contextualize that process of understanding who's there and how good a fit they are to you. And you go through typically a process to do that. So one of the things that we found and in terms of looking at the market is that the sources of information around to do that are fairly limited, okay? So typically they consist of walking around a show downstairs and getting sent lots of things afterwards and giving out your business card, etc. There's certain things you can read, magazines, etc. We don't go to an independent, an Amazon site and read all the reviews of what somebody thought of that particular product in the same way that you can on consumer goods, etc. And when you look at the market analyst view, the analysts are the independent commentators in the market. That's what we do as part of what we do. But actually, a lot of that's very US-centric. So organizations like Gartner and Forrester, mainly IT analysts, Bursin, again, US analysts. A lot of the view and a lot of the vendor commentary is very geared towards the US market. Okay? So one of the things that we wanted to do was to try and really address that and to create an analysis model that really talked more about the European market, or what was relevant to European and international organizations based in Europe. And we call it the eLearnity 9 Grid. We first launched it in July last year with two initial sectors, which were LMS and bespoke, deliberately picking one which was a platform or a software business, one which was a service-based business. So that's, in case you wondered why those two, that was the rationale behind it. And we are in the process of extending that to other sectors and also in digging into them in more detail. The goals of this were pretty simple. We wanted something that was relevant to HR, the HR talent learning organization, rather than written for IT, because the majority of people that are at these kinds of conferences and making these decisions in the learning technology market particularly are not necessarily IT people. We wanted it to be relevant, as I said, to EMEA organizations, and we wanted it to use it as a tool that could stimulate meaningful conversations that were relevant. In other words, you could contextualize the way you interpret it. Okay, how many of you are familiar with the Gartner Magic Quadrant? Okay, so one of the most common reference models in terms of the analyst marketplace for talking about a market is a thing called Magic Quadrant. It's a Boston box, so it's a 2x2 matrix. The top right-hand corner is called the leader quadrant, and all the vendors want to appear in the leader quadrant, and if they don't appear in the leader quadrant, they don't issue a press release. If they are in the leader quadrant, they do issue a press release. Okay? But because it's based around a process that's largely been driven for the US market originally, especially in learning technology, lots of vendors downstairs won't even appear in it or have any chance of appearing in it. So one of the things that we wanted to do, the interpretation, the use, the value of it, in our view, is quite limited. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to expand on that. The other thing is just to bear in mind when we show it, and I'm not going to talk about it in any detail, but we use this as a client-specific analysis tool. So we're presenting to you some generic market views of the LMS market, the bespoke market, but we can actually do this analysis on a client-specific basis. So we can look at specific vendor options or incumbent suppliers you have and do the same kind of mapping and create a conversation around relative strengths and options in terms of your existing vendor base. And that actually makes it a really powerful tool, as well as a tool for driving actions. It may not be about just selecting a new vendor. It may be around what do I do with my existing vendors in order to maximize the value or to increase their coverage across the business and so on. Does that make sense? The model. David, just as you get have a drink. Go on, you.
Go between two places at the same time. Okay, so in terms of the model, we look at effectively two dimensions. The first dimension is around the performance, and when we think about performance, we think about it in terms of, so as a supplier, how successful are they? When they go, do they get shortlisted by organizations such as yours? And once they are shortlisted, do they win? So that gives you a sense almost of their performance in the market. But another part of that aspect is really around customer advocacy. So when you meet their customers at events like this or at round tables that we run, what do they say about that particular supplier? Are they full of regret, or are they full of support, or are they full of woe? All these different emotions can come out and through a little bit of a short conversation. And that is also part of the performance angle that we pick out when we're considering the model. So there's a few different layers, which is all in that sort of performance nugget. The other side is around potential, and we tend to think about potential as being a combination of two things. The first is the scope, so how much does it do? So it's, if you think of it maybe as a Swiss Army knife, is it a one-bladed Swiss Army knife, or is it a 1,000-bladed Swiss Army knife? So that gives you a sense of scope. How much does it do? How many widgets and gadgets does it have attached? The other side of it is around this sort of potential angle is, so what's the depth? So it may do lots of things, but if it's only a Swiss Army knife with one screwdriver on it, it's not going to be something you're going to want to take your car apart with. So it's really in terms of the depth of sophistication, it's right, so how sophisticated is it? So you get this breadth and depth, so it's like, that's what we really package in terms of potential. And in terms of our model, we think of it as bandings. So we sort of pick out a lower band, mid potential, a lower potential, and a higher potential on the performance. Again, just generic bandings to help us sort of put people into a particular box. And think of it in some ways as like a talent grid. That's what we're sort of effectively trying to analyze the market using. Hopefully it's something that's familiar to you and you can think about in terms of these vendors. We also think about presence, so that's their size, their scale in the marketplace, so the numbers of customers and the size of those customers, again, lower, mid, and higher, and then the total cost of ownership. So this is the soup to nuts cost of working with these particular suppliers, and that can involve the initial implementation cost, it's the license cost, it's the administration overheads that you have in administering the system to deliver benefit to your business. And there's probably a host of other things, David. I'm just thinking of in terms of things you'd want to add to that TCO.
Yeah, I mean, we think about really as almost what I say is total life cycle cost. So in a software system, obviously you can talk about what does it cost me to buy, what's it cost me to implement, what does it cost me to operate, what does it cost me to upgrade, maybe what does it cost me to end of life. There's some kind of cycle. In a service business, it's kind of different. So if I look at bespoke e-learning, there is something around, okay, what does it cost me to produce content? How expensive are they relatively to produce similar types of content? But there's also other factors there, for example, translation and localization. If every time I want to translate it, I have to pay again, etc. So sometimes the life cycle cost around content is actually a very hidden factor. It's not very obvious. Also, if every time I try and deploy it on something, so if I've got a business that's got multiple LMSs internally, which a lot of the globals have, if when I try and run it on a different LMS it doesn't work, how many of you had problems with content that doesn't track properly and you get into a technical remediation? So some vendors are actually better at delivering first time into different environments and getting it to work. They kind of technically have got that nailed down. Others, we've seen patterns where they've consistently struggled to make it work, or they don't respond to it. Now, clearly, from your point of view as the buyer of this all impacts how, not just how quickly you can do things, but what it costs you and how much management effort you put in doing it. So it's around the sort of total life cycle cost around this. And the trajectory is really simple. It's which direction do we think they're heading in the model? So in other words, it's a relative statement to their own position around, do we think they're relatively increasing their potential faster than the overall market, really? So one of the things that, and when we put this up, I'll be amazed if we don't get questions around it, is why are they left of them on the model? And it may not because we think that relative between those two, that they are different, but that actually relative to that vendor themselves, there may be a more rapidly increasing their performance in the market, etc.
But overall, I just think that So there's 5 dimensions to the model. And each one is something, a lens that you may think is relevant when you're coming to select. And that's why we try to sort of almost create this sort of simple view, but it gives you some reference point to talk to maybe even to your stakeholders around. So what is our cost point? What sophistication and breadth do we need in the platform? What performance are we expecting to see? Do we want to be a small fish with a big player? Do we want to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond? And those are some of the conversations that get driven out.
Yeah, and actually, and the other thing is, how does that trade off against how much we're prepared to spend? Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's missing from a lot of the analysis that you can get, is really tough to do, is, you know, okay, I can go and buy this thing with all these bells and whistles. We intuitively know it's probably going to cost me a lot more money and be more difficult to implement, but that may not be the case. There may be relative differences around it. So this thing about total cost of ownership is something that, you know, the first thing that somebody said was cost. But in reality, it's not just about the acquisition cost, it's around that whole cost. So actually creating some sense around that, I think, is quite important. There are, on each of these 9 grids, there is a report document, which you can download on your phone or thing, or on your iPad, and say with one click. There's a QR code under each one of these, or next to these. If you want to access it now, by all means, just scan it and it will download straight on there. It's just single click and through, no registration. Each of those will provide, so each of those reports has obviously got the 9-grid model, but it's also got a list of vendors that we filtered in there. The list of vendors is filtered to be with reference to our largely target market, which is EMEA-based corporate type organizations. Okay, there are plenty of others. I mean, we could have hundreds of vendors on those, but we've deliberately filtered it to the ones that we think are most relevant. Each of the vendors has then a report in there, so it positions their core rating, so where they are in the 9-grid. So this example says core challenger, some basic information, and then there's a commentary. And the commentary is deliberately quite succinct. Sorry, question? No. So we run a number of different levels of what we call core research process. So we basically do a whole bunch of vendor briefings. A lot of the intel that's gone into this is actually from corporate customers and feedback. And there are a number of actually people in the room who have been party to that process in the past as part of roundtables and things we're doing. So a lot of the view of the vendors is shaped by what the corporates say, their customers say about them that we speak to as part of our research network. We do run briefings with them because it's also useful to understand what the vendors say about themselves as well. But that's not a paid-for process at a basic level. We do, and to be transparent, we also have a kind of enhanced level where we would do deeper briefing with our organizations on a more frequent basis, which is paid for, but we do, that's deliberately so we can have more time and we can drive to them in more depth. We're around, particularly some of the market leaders in the sector. An LMS, for example, across 20 LMS providers. Is variable and interesting. And I'm happy to talk about that. It's probably better to put specific ones up and kind of talk about that. Generally, I think pretty much all the vendors see the value in EMEA-specific analysis. They don't necessarily like where we position them, and we have a healthy discussion with them. And in reality, what that translates as being is, show me the evidence. Yeah? So we understand that, almost by definition, everybody really wants to be seen as higher potential and higher performance. But in reality, our view is across the market, that's not necessarily warranted. And you can see across the different grids, there are very few actually that are positioned within that particular box. The other thing is, it may not be the best place for you as a customer to be. Maybe you want somebody that has a more limited proposition, but is really good at execution. At a lower total cost of ownership. And that's why I said this creates much richer conversations, I think, around it. But I have to say, generally the feedback from the vendors has been constructive and positive. They like the fact they're included, but they don't necessarily like exactly what we say about them, but that's part of the integrity of the process. Yeah? So what does somebody have to do to be seen as relevant? Primarily, we have a corporate research network which has got about 100, 150 organizations, typically large corporate organizations. The first filter for that is who do we see as the names that are within the frame in that situation? Who are the people that they are talking to, using already, shortlisting? Who are they interested in? So there are a number of examples. So a good example on the LMS one, which is the one we'll put up first, is someone like Totra, which is obviously open source stuff built off the back of the Kineo work in the bespoke market. When I look in the enterprise base and look across major organizations, we do not see that currently shortlisting as a thing at an enterprise level. However, they potentially are a disruptor in the market. And certainly their potential growth or accelerated growth could be much faster than somebody that's a more traditional but localized LMS company. So we're looking at both of those type of factors. Let me put one up, and then you can ask some questions. So LMS, this is the 2014 version, so it was updated and published as of yesterday. Okay. The report, as I said, the reports are available to access. Most cases, the names are actually provided. Again, just to be clear in terms of positioning, red, higher total cost of ownership, yellow, medium, green, lower. The size of the things based on their overall market presence within the market, and then the positioning based on what David talked about. Performance, customer market performance, potential, scope and sophistication, and then some feeling around relative trajectory. Questions?
Can you redefine trajectory?
So trajectory is where do we think they're heading in terms of our assessment relative to, I guess, themselves and the overall market. So if somebody is innovating faster than the market, we would expect the trajectory to be the higher part of the in an individual zone. Okay, sorry, I'll stand in front of the diagram. If somebody is in the bottom left, it means that probably we think their relative position is declining both in terms of potential and performance. Okay? It is not necessarily relative to the other people in that sector. We've had lots of discussions around it where somebody said, but how can they be right of us because we're actually a lot bigger than them and we're growing, etc. So yeah, but actually their relative growth to themselves, their delta is faster. Yeah, even though your absolute growth is higher because you're a bigger company. Does that make sense? It's easier if a 1 million business becomes a 3 million business, that's a very rapid growth, as opposed to if a 10 million business becomes a 12 million business, that's a kind of more normal growth curve. Okay? So what do you want to know? Anybody interested in LMSs? Okay? So questions on LMS vendors in the European market. Go.
Specifically, success factors plus a strategic challenger.
Yep.
High potential.
Yep.
What do you think's holding them back? Because obviously they're quite plateau, and then being quite plateau, they then got quite less out. Why are they strategic? Why strategic challenger rather than strategic leader?
Okay, so that was the question. So the question is success factors. Why are they a strategic challenger and not a strategic leader? Which was a question they asked. In fact, I think the statement was, but we're always a strategic leader. Okay? I just not, but David had the call.
That is true.
They said, we are always a strategic leader. Why are we not? So there's a very simple answer to that. It's called customer advocacy. So basically, following the acquisition by SuccessFactors and subsequently SAP, a lot of their larger enterprise customers in EMEA, we have found have had a more problematic relationship with them, and their relative commitment to that platform has declined. However, this is the 2014 version versus the 2013 version, which we put out in July, and actually their relative position has slightly changed. Okay, we've actually moved them further right because actually they have quite a positive market momentum. So it's probably not a well-known fact, but The learning module within the SuccessFactors suite, if anybody's not familiar with it, SuccessFactors was performance management. They have a thing called Business Suite. They have a recruitment platform and so on. The learning is the highest selling module within their suite. So clearly they are being more successful in selling this to people. However, some of their existing customers, particularly some of the existing Plateau customers, are not all happy. Okay? So that's why we've moderated. Another one, similar to that actually, we get the same question around sum total sometimes, because sum total is one of the domestic, certainly one of the global market leaders, partly because, it was a very strong player, but also because it went and kept buying other people, right? So it kept buying customer bases. So the market presence is actually huge. But what we've seen is significant customer attrition, and actually a lot of those customers have moved on to alternative platforms. And that's one of the reasons. So in absolute market terms, they will outsell significantly some of these players here. But because we're seeing significant attrition, so a good example, really, really good recent example, and it will please Ian because he sat at the back, is BT. So BT was a sum total customer, is now deploying Saba. Okay? Next question. Sorry. Simon.
Rationale for Cornerstone being outright by itself there.
Yeah, and that's this is a kind of difficult one. Cornerstone's market momentum has been very, very strong. I mean, basically, you're looking at something like a 58% compound growth on a kind of revenue level on a year-by-year basis, right, which is a very strong performance by anybody's imagination. When we first started looking at Cornerstone, nobody had heard of them, and then they became, somebody that was interesting to add into a thing towards somebody that was automatically in. So David talked about do they shortlist? Suddenly they were in every shortlist. You didn't, and now we're in the situation, and then they've gone through a process where they've won a lot. One of the things that we've done with Cornerstone is we've actually moved them. Okay, we had them on the left-hand side, left-hand trajectory, because we were concerned with that they would be able to sustain the growth. Periodically, they've gone through what I would say some technical delivery issues, more around services than around platform. And one of the things that we were concerned about was whether they would be able to sustain the growth, number one. And number two is match it across talent, because Cornerstone, like many of these guys at the top, is a cross-talent provider. So it sells recruiting cloud, performance cloud, and so on. And translating success from one sector into the other sectors is quite difficult to do. Yeah. However, those concerns have largely not materialized, is probably the best way of putting it. So we have given them the benefit of the doubt on that. But again, this is something that we will review on an annual basis and look to potentially make that. Joan?
Should organizations be looking at just an LMS, or should they be considering a bigger picture like an HR system? Are you assisting in that way?
So the question was, should they just be looking at an LMS, or should they be looking at some kind of integrated HR, learning as part of an integrated HR suite or talent suite? So the answer is yes, they should be considering it. The majority of decisions we still see are, so there is this kind of concept in the market called integrated talent management, where learning sits as part of a whole set of performance talent processes. And the reality is what we see is that is not really it's not really an executed concept at the moment. It's more concept than reality. And particularly for learning as a silo, and also actually for recruiting, but that's obviously a bit off thing. They tend to be silo-driven decisions. So you tend to see learning-driven decisions, but what we talk about is being opportunistically hybrid. So quite often those, when the RFPs come out, now include things like performance management and other pieces as well. And the buying decision is changing to become more hybrid. Yeah? So absolutely you should be considering it. And actually that's a huge part of the pivot, particularly in an enterprise scenario, where you have things like the Workdays and SAPs and Oracles. You've got that is driving a lot of the way in which some people are now looking at some of what we would consider a silo piece, which is learning or performance or so on. One more question. Sorry, yes. So at the moment we have a general thing. So this is focused actually around, that's a good point. So we're talking about large enterprises, and actually the majority of that lens is dominated by internal staff. Yeah? Actually, nearly all cases, and one of the things we're trying to influence corporates to think about is their consideration of what we say is the external people chain, so suppliers, contractors, if you've got partners, partner networks, and so on. And one of the trends we're seeing within, particularly on the LMS world, is that organizations looking to move towards a single platform that can serve both audiences. But I would say generally this is skewed towards an internal audience primarily because that's where we are. So, sorry.
Follow-up question on that. I've just been tasked with planning an LMS, but it's for a commercial analysis, so we're selling training.
Yep.
And I literally am just starting out to look. I don't know a huge amount about the market, but everywhere I seem to look, there are no e-commerce modules attached to anything.
Okay. So again, because of this tendency to focus on internal staff audiences primarily, there are specific tools that are designed, actually many of which we're not actually covering, which are geared more towards training providers. They have different administration kind of requirements, etc. And I mean things like managing public training curriculum versus private training curriculum. There's different concepts that kind of really don't exist in the corporate sense. The majority of these, particularly at the higher levels, will have e-commerce options around them. So all of them will probably have examples of people using it in an external training context, potentially with money changing hands. Yeah. So, but that's more of a function as you get further up. That's not always true. So there are products like Absorb down here, which actually have they've focused on part of that as a market. So they actually have things at the lower end. Okay. One more question, and then we'll go on. Sorry. Yeah.
Question about user interfaces.
Yes.
I have a feeling, back in the 90s when the systems that are here, even the ones that are on the top here,
Yeah.
they are good, and it feels like I'm back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Yes.
Systems. Do you have any personal reflections, having seen a lot of systems, is any system that is feels more like this year?
So the questions around user interface and feeling like we're stepping back into a different decade. Yeah, I was going to say century. Yeah. So the reality is the user, as we talked about earlier in terms of decision factors, user experience has become a key factor in pretty much every evaluation that's going on now. In fact, sometimes, I'm not going to say it's too dominant, but it can sometimes become a bit one-dimensional in the sense that they're actually not looking at the back end and whether the back end can manage the training, the operation that they're trying to do. But this is a big deal. Every vendor is focusing and investing on building their user experience and improving it. At the more, sophisticated end of the scale, okay, these products are more complicated. Yeah? There is functionality in some of these which has every potential configuration option and parameter that you could think of around the way that you manage, I don't know, wait lists on classroom training and everything else. Or blended program definition and the architecture. But some of this is so abstracted to be unintelligible and not usable. And that's sometimes feedback you get. This stuff is too complex. We don't need it that complex. But the problem is enterprise customers can't decide what they want. There's not a single process for approving things that's agreed and globally. And even if they define it like that, the reality is when they come to implement it, they find there are exceptions. Yeah? So the reason that there is a sophisticated end of the scale is because when you want to manage that in a large, complex organization, you need more sophistication. That tends to bring more administrative complexity and a drop in user experience. Sometimes vendors have separated their user portals and their manager portals and their admin portals, and sometimes the front end looks really nice, the admin looks like, green screen SAP, R3 type stuff from the 70s, let alone from the 90s. I mean, that would be a step forward. But generally now, everybody's focusing on improving that. There are certain products which definitely have more sophisticated, are more Amazon-like. That's the reference model. When we talk to people about what do you want, everybody kind of normally when you're going through this thing, say, well, I want it like Amazon. Yeah, actually, Amazon is massively sophisticated and complicated underneath, but we don't want it to feel like that at the front end. So yes, they're all focused on
And I
that.
think another side of that is actually lots of the vendors are starting to push a lot more the portalization of their own product, so that you can actually get a much richer experience based around a particular user role or a particular project. And they're gearing the tools up to make that much more sustainable for you to do or get partners to develop. So they'll have toolkits that you can effectively rebrand the entire platform and have a very compelling front end. Some of those toolkits will include web parts that actually you can do almost like web editing on the homepage and set up your own widgets, etc. So they are approaching that, but it is such a complex issue because actually an onboarding portal is very different from a portal that supports new product launches or systems processes or the development process. So these become quite multi-dimensional, especially when you start to translate that across multiple business units.
Final comment,
so
then.
have something that's sustainable for you as well, which is probably an issue.
Final comment, then I want to just move on to the next one. If you look at the report, I mean, this is on each of the pages, it will talk about something, and typically the thing around user experience is one of the things that gets touched on. Behind that, we also have what we call perspectives, vendor perspectives. So we have then individual vendor reports and deep ones, 25-page reports, which will talk specifically around a whole bunch of things in terms of functional and non-functional factors and so on. So there's a whole bunch of assets there available to do it. Bespoke e-learning. Before you ask any more questions. And we're happy to ask questions afterwards. That's the whole point of this, yeah? It's what do you want to know? So bespoke e-learning, again, same model. As you can see, in this case, we actually have identified 3 organizations within the strategic leaders quadrant. A lot of this is really around, in terms of the in terms of the potentials around now, the kind of breadth and capability that they have, the richness of what they are able to create, and to a degree, a little bit around the scalability of their process. You know, one of the things that we found in bespoke learning market is full of lots and lots of small companies in a general industry sense. And the reason for that is you have people that are very switched on, very good at doing certain things, but they're literally either a 3-man, 10-man operation or a 20-man operation, and there's a 20 or 20-person operation. There is a glass ceiling which they often struggle to get over and turn into the next generation potential leader type organ thing. So there's that's some of the dynamics there. There is also a range of cost around things, and people tend to talk, you know, they used to talk about cost per hour, content hour, and where would that be, and obviously based on the level of sophistication of what you want to have. Those ranges vary from vendor to vendor, and also, as I said, some of them are kind of tend to deliver stuff naturally that fits into things like if it's going to be translated multiple times, or there's a different model around it in terms of how it's created. What questions do you have on bespoke? Anybody interested in bespoke? I should ask that question first. Yeah, okay. A little. Okay, Simon. This is skewed towards UK market. That's why you won't notice lots of domestic European players on there. Okay, and we deliberately did that because bespoke is a national market primarily, with a few exceptions. Have we? Yeah, so I mean, as part of obviously the coverage with our corporate clients, and a lot of which are globally multinationals, what we're often doing is looking at other providers outside that. On the 9 grid, we've just filtered it based on relevance to largely UK-driven decisions. As you can imagine, if we did one of these for France or Germany, it would have mostly different names on it. Yeah, not all of them, but mostly. And then obviously when we go into Asia or APAC or US, again, it would have different. It's very much a geographical market, as opposed to the LMS market, which is what we talk about EMEA skewed global. So it's weighted towards EMEA, and there are some local players, but actually most of them are global providers. We don't have a 9 grid published for other markets. Yep, any?
You go to these providers, so for example, they'll provide you with an LMS and bespoke e-learning.
Yep.
Epic are strategic leaders for bespoke e-learning, but they'll use Moodle, which on your previous grid is a limited option.
Yep.
Do you look at a total package and look at them in that sense, or do you just break it down?
We are specifically looking at this around their capabilities and story in terms of doing bespoke e-learning. We will in the future look at more end-to-end kind of managed learning services, which will include multiple aspects of it. And similarly, when we're producing one of these for talent management, which will be released in March, that looks at capability across multiple silos, performance, etc. What we found is most of the decisions around e-learning award is driven by an e-learning, a bespoke e-learning driven decision. There are LMSs are used tactically and provided tactically by those vendors, but very rarely are they provided strategically. So when you go into an organization, they're running something else as their global enterprise LMS. But they may build, for example, buy a custom Moodle site and use it as a leadership portal to go alongside specific content they have, because they can control the user experiences rather than the 1990s clunky interface. Other questions on bespoke? Yes? So in terms of cost or in terms of... Yeah. So probably the simple, so there's two dimensions to that. One is in terms of market performance, and that's typically how much are we actually seeing them appearing in the corporate decisions at the moment. That's on the performance side. Okay, so in fact, when you look at it, most of them are actually on this axis. So they're kind of similar-ish, yeah? Upside is maybe kind of less so. We see them as, literally, as it says, as a potential challenger. There's somebody that's got a marketing story out there, but we haven't necessarily seen that realized in terms of actual decisions to award business or seen the customer advocacy yet. And this could be a timing issue. Lots of people, there are quite a lot of companies that come into via this space. That's the place they can start. In terms of this, it's really around scale of capability, the level of sophistication, the types of contents they're creating, and sometimes the flexibility they show as a business. You know, do they have one model, or actually are they happy to adapt that model and use it otherwise around? David, do you want to add anything?
I think some of it is actually how much we're also seeing some of the innovation in content delivery. So people who are involved in maybe more progressive mobile programs, things they've actually delivered. And I think it's interesting because you end up with almost two stories. There's the things that they say they're doing, and they tend to be sort of maybe pilot stuff, but there is the reality of what people have done and the feedback that you then get from customers. And there's some great advocates around mobile learning from particular large international style corporates who have made a big success of it. But there are other, and we tend to sort of reward those within the matrix itself. But there are others who are still exploring. And it's just, I suppose, again, it's that timing issue of, there's not necessarily saying that those organizations that haven't made those inroads yet are a bigger risk, but they might be even better bet in some ways, but they're just not further down that road. And we've tried to sort of differentiate that in terms of the potential. And it's really about sort of the feedback we're getting from our corporate research network around, yeah, that's worked really well for us, or we still haven't seen that yet. And this will change over time because this sort of multi-channel delivery approach is becoming much more important to people. And we're seeing that sort of, I suppose, across more and more corporates, actually, that they understand that it has to be more than flash-based content is almost an accepted norm within the marketplace in a way now.
Let me move on, because we've got 5 minutes. Cool. Is that right? And one model. So, who's interested in authoring tools and learning content management and such things? Okay. You're getting more apathetic, you know, it's kind of a gentle wave. It was much more assertive at the beginning. Okay, so again, same model. There's one tweak on this that we should explain, is when you look at the authoring tools market, what you realize is there are some fundamentally different types of tools and technologies that are available. And what we've done at the moment is really two things. One is we have focused on splitting those into 3 main segments, what we call desktop authoring tools. So these are the classic e-learning authoring tools you install on your PC and run, etc. Then what we call collaborative tools, so they're typically server-based, and they include some form of collaborative or workflow concept. There's multiple people working on these. There may be some sharing capability and so on. So you see that's often quite different to I'm a I'm sitting there writing on my own a piece of e-learning and I want to put it together. And then at the top end, what we call learning content management systems, which tend to take that collaboration dynamic and scale it. So they are much more around higher scale production, lots of people, different roles, workflows, approvals, asset sharing, version control, maybe publishing to multiple output types, etc. They tend to boost a lot of that functionality. Inherently, the LCMSs are expensive. Okay, because they are much more sophisticated in what they can do. The other thing is that they tend to, the value proposition, you'll find that when you read the comments, the value proposition for them tends to be more evident when you have higher scale. So if you've got 50 or 100 people, either in a single team or globally, who are developing hundreds of projects and things and translating them and delivering them to mobile and etc. things, you can't do that with a copy of Lectora. Okay? You just can't do it. So there is a potential. So one of the things, and again, put it on the table, is you will see there is a tendency, although these things have a variant potential, a lot of these are, the ones that we've included here, because there are hundreds we haven't included, but these are the ones we see used in the corporate environment, and they tend to be, higher performant. Some of these ones are more emerging tools, okay, the collaborative ones, and the LCMSs tend to have got much greater overall strategic potential, but in reality, they often have lower customer advocacy, or the barriers to entry are higher and they're more expensive. Okay, questions? Yes. So have companies come to us to ask if existing suppliers, so I mentioned that earlier, we can do it on a client-specific basis. So one of the things that we have started to do, and it's early days, but it's part of the design of the tool, is that we can use this to calibrate internal solution options, in other words, the existing solutions that are there, as well as, say, maybe some external candidates, and then position them based on their performance, potential, and presence within your company. And that's a key thing, is because obviously, and it doesn't matter really whether it's an LMS or an authoring tool, etc. Most of the time, there are multiple competing platforms. Some are only being used by some audiences, some are only being used to do one type of thing, others are being used more flexibly. So yes, we can contextualize it. Simon?
On the LCMS side, are you starting to see those being used more effectively, and are there any particular cases where you've seen them work very well and really create strong value, and anyone perhaps afterwards you can point towards in your answer, but good to understand
Good.
how it works really well.
So LCMS is an interesting thing. It's not, it's a market sector that's been there for a long time, an acronym that's been there for probably 10 years at least, and it's really struggled to build what I'd say is real market momentum, and they're trying to justify what their value proposition is and so on. But there are, yes, examples. What we're seeing, I think, is a bit of a renaissance in interest, partly driven by the fact that now, one of the things before, we did some research actually 10 years ago, we did some research about 7 years ago, looking at it specifically in detail, and what we found is that the e-learning teams weren't really interested. Unless they had a distributed production model or something, they just weren't that interested, because they were just worrying about delivering one format of output. That's no longer the case. Now they want to do mobile content, performance support, as well as fixed e-learning, and maybe also, by the way, we'll print something as well.
And there's also the tracking of the informal resources, so things that aren't courses. So how do you do that? And if you're thinking about 70-20-10 or an informal training model within your organization, there's potentially a whole lot of learning that you're not able to track within your LMS unless people are registering. Some of the LCMS products are starting to enable you to track that sort of activity, but know that there's a single point of publishing, so that when you change one diagram around one critical design of your aircraft, that will update on the instructor notes and also the e-learning, plus the technical manuals that people are using to tighten that widget that stops the plane falling out of the sky. So those things are starting to appear, and that's probably quite a good case study almost in its own right of where people are finding value, where there is quite almost a high risk around content, but also wanting to do multi-channel, multi-delivery without the overheads of having to repurpose it each time.
There are some cases, however, there's also still what I would say is disappointment.
Yes.
organisations where they haven't lived up to it, and actually, frankly, where they've bought it and then not implemented it in a way that's ever likely to be. So they buy it with one business case and then implement something that's actually very different and use it in a more narrow way, and then it's not a sustainable kind of situation. But I think the underlying drivers that talk about multi-format output creation, some kind of, I don't want to have to have a new development process every time I want to put it on a mobile. Okay? I don't want to do that. If I'm creating hundreds of courses, I'd like just to know it runs on mobile as well. So we can talk about responsive design, but in reality, we've got different contexts we want things to use, and therefore, the more you drive towards that, the more the kind of single sourcing idea makes sense. We're getting more drivers around version control, content compliance, so there's a rationale that makes sense, and also personalization of content, dynamic delivery and things. So there's a bunch of drivers there. However, at the moment, those vendors are still struggling to drive costs. One last question? They'll lynch you because it's champagne outside. So. Yeah, and the majority of the input we get from customers is actually around what they have, right? And I guess their commitment to it going forward, because plenty of them have stuff that they don't really want and would like to change. So, yes, a lot of it's based on customer view rather than just what I'd say is market demand. And that's why when David talks about performance, it's a blend of market performance and customer performance. And that's really important. Somebody can appear, as we talked about before, on the left, either because they haven't yet built enough customer momentum or because actually they've got lots of customers, but most of them don't like them. And you can be in that place for a number of reasons. We are out of time.
Yes.
We'll be around for a while. As I said, download the reports because the commentary I think you might find interesting. And any questions, we'll be around for a while. Thank you.
Thank you.